What if the very ground beneath your feet was a trap? What if the land you chose to build upon was a frozen swamp, battered by icy winds and relentless storms? Peter the First faced this brutal reality when he declared that his new city would rise where none dared to dream, a place so hostile it seemed impossible to tame. But he was determined. Here, at the edge of the Baltic, would stand his window to Europe, a symbol of a reborn Russia. The stakes were immense, and the consequences irreversible. Friends, be sure to subscribe to my Quiet History channel, like it, and leave a comment of at least 7 words. This is necessary for the channel to function. Share this video with others if you think it's important. Thank you. Long before grand palaces and towering spires adorned the banks of the Neva, this land was a wilderness, dense forests, endless marshes, and a river that split into countless channels, disappearing into reeds and soggy shores. It was a place untouched by the ambitions of empires, home to the Finno-Ugric peoples, especially the Izhora, whose name would later define the entire region. Their lives were simple, bound to the rhythms of nature, fishing, hunting, slash-and-burn farming, and cautious trade with passing merchants. Yet beneath this quiet existence lay a land of strategic importance, a watery crossroads that would soon ignite the ambitions of great powers. The Izhora preserved ancient beliefs long after Christianity spread through the heart of Russia. Their wooden temples whispered of a world older than the Orthodox faith, a cultural island amid shifting tides of conquest and faith. From the Novgorodians they borrowed language and customs, but their identity remained fiercely distinct. This was a land where history's currents ran deep, where every tree and stone held stories of survival and resistance. Yet the true power of this place was not in its soil, but in its water, the Neva River, a vital artery connecting Lake Ladoga to the Baltic Sea, a gateway for traders and warriors alike. Since the 9th century, the Neva's waters carried the Varangian fleets, Scandinavian warriors on their legendary route from the Varangians to the Greeks. This was no easy path. The river's swift currents, sprawling delta, and unpredictable floods made navigation perilous. But it was the only link between the vast Russian interior and the Western world. Here, 2 civilizations collided: the Eastern Novgorodians, desperate to control trade and tribute, and the Western Swedish and German crusaders pushing eastward to claim new lands. The border was a fragile, shifting line where every patch of earth could change hands overnight, dictated by the ruthless game of power. In 1240, on these very shores, Prince Alexander won a battle that would echo through history, the Battle of the Neva. His victory earned him the name Nevsky, a symbol of Russian resilience against foreign invasion. But centuries later, the tides of fortune turned again. After the Livonian War, Russia briefly gained access to the Baltic, only to lose it all in the humiliating Treaty of Stolbovo in 1617. The Swedes seized control of the Neva's mouth, cutting Russia off from the sea and strangling its trade routes. To cement their grip, the Swedes built the fortress of Nyenskans in 1611, right where the Okta River meets the Neva. Its name, a chilling blend of Finnish and German, meant reed fortification, a barrier that blocked Russia's path to the Baltic. This was no mere outpost. It was a strategic chokehold designed to choke off Russia's access to maritime power forever. The stakes could not have been higher. And yet, in the face of this blockade, Peter the Great made a fateful choice. He would build a city on this cursed swamp, under relentless rain and cannon fire, defying nature and enemies alike. The Petropavlovsk fortress, the Admiralty, the first palaces, they all rose from mud and blood, symbols of a new Russia daring to claim its place in the world. But every stone laid carried a price, paid in sweat, tears, and lives. The story of Saint Petersburg is a story of irreversible decisions, of human fear confronted and conquered, and of a nation forever changed. This is the tale we unravel, how a city was born from the chaos of war and nature's fury, how its granite walls still breathe secrets of sacrifice and ambition. Join us as we uncover the unexpected stories, rare facts, and hidden mysteries that pulse beneath the northern capital's surface. Subscribe to Quiet History for daily journeys into the past, where every story is a window into the choices that shaped our world. What if the fate of an empire hinged on a small, muddy fortress at the mouth of a river? What price would a czar pay to reclaim lost ground and reopen the gates to the sea? In the late 17th century, the fortress of Nein stood as a thorn in Russia's side, a strategic bulwark of Sweden, carved from earthen walls and wooden bastions guarding the vital waterway between Lake Ladoga and the Baltic Sea. Around it, a bustling trading settlement had blossomed, a melting pot of Swedes, Finns, Germans, Russians, and Baltic Latvians. But beneath the surface of commerce and craftsmanship, tensions simmered, a powder keg waiting for a spark. Nein was more than just a military outpost. It was a symbol of Swedish dominance on the Neva River, a lifeline for trade, with workshops, Lutheran churches, mills, and merchants drawn from all over the Swedish realm. By the 70s of the 17th century, its population swelled to nearly 2,000 souls. Yet the uneasy coexistence of Orthodox Russians under Swedish rule brewed silent resentment. Orthodox churches were forbidden, worship was clandestine, and religious oppression lingered like a shadow. For Russia, this loss was a bitter wound, an unbearable loss of access to the sea that crippled its ambitions. Tsar Alexis Mikhailovich had already dreamed of reclaiming Nein, but his hands were tied. His nation was consumed by wars with the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and a whirlwind of internal reforms. The moment was not yet ripe. However, the tide would turn with the rise of Peter the Great, a ruler whose vision went far beyond borders and battles. Peter understood that without a window to the west, Russia was condemned to isolation, cut off from maritime trade, modern technology, and vital diplomatic ties. The mere existence of a Swedish fortress in the Neva Delta was a provocation, a challenge to his empire's future. Despite Swedish control, Russian old believers, peasants, and traders continued to trickle into the perilous borderlands, seeking refuge from taxes and persecution. Some built hidden mills on streams like Karpovka. Others cultivated gardens near what is today Litani Prospect. These acts of quiet defiance sowed the seeds of a new people's epic, a story not born from empty land, but from contested, dangerous soil. Decades before the founding of Saint Petersburg, the stage was set. A Swedish fortress guarding the gateway to the Baltic, scattered Russian settlements clinging to riverbanks, a swampy strategic delta awaiting transformation. Then came August of 1700, the eruption of the Great Northern War. Peter struck alliances with Augustus the Strong of Saxony and Frederick IV of Denmark, aiming to reclaim the Baltic coast lost in the Treaty of Stolbovo. The Tsar expected swift victory, confident in his coalitions, but November brought a shattering blow at Narva. The young, disciplined forces of King Charles XII crushed the Russian army, exposing the empire's unpreparedness and shaking Peter to his core. The dream of a quick triumph crumbled into a harrowing, drawn-out conflict. Narva was a bitter lesson. For the first time, Peter tasted defeat, not with resignation, but with renewed fury. He refused to sue for peace or buy off the enemy. Instead, he launched a radical overhaul of Russia's military. European-style regiments rose from the ashes. Foreign officers were recruited, and weapons factories churned out new arms. Within 2 years, this transformed army won a pivotal victory, capturing the fortress of Noteburg, known as Oreshek, at the Neva's source. This was no mere battle won. It was a stepping stone toward the ultimate prize, Nien's fortress at the river's mouth. Nyenskans, as it was called, controlled the gateway from Lake Ladoga to the Gulf of Finland, granting Sweden dominance over the Neva's waterways. Its defenses were formidable: earthworks lined with timber, artillery emplacements designed to repel any assault. The fortress was more than stone and wood. It was the chokehold on Russia's access to the West. The conflict was no longer just about territory. It was about survival, pride, and the irreversible gamble of empire building. Even amidst Swedish control, the harsh climate and damp conditions made life miserable, as chronicled by German engineer Christian Lassie in his letters. Yet every challenge hardened the resolve of those who dared to dream of a Russian rebirth on these contested shores. The battle for Nien was more than military strategy. It was a crucible of human fear, ambition, and the painful consequences of choices that would echo through centuries. The coming storm was inevitable. Peter the Great's vision was clear, but the road was steep and the cost high. The fortress at the Neva Delta was not just a fortress. It was a symbol of a fractured past and a contested future. Who would claim the right to rewrite history? The answer would come through blood, fire, and unyielding will. The story of how a swampy delta transformed into the imperial gateway of Russia. The stage was set. The players were in position. The hour of reckoning had arrived. What does it take to build a fortress from nothing? To craft a city born of blood and sweat under the watchful eye of a relentless czar? Peter himself was not above directing where each log should fall, personally guiding this monstrous endeavor. The earliest defenses were nothing but earthworks, reinforced with logs, simple yet brutal in their rawness. Every bastion was named for one of Peter's closest allies, their names etched into the very geography of the fortress, turning land into a map of loyalty and power. But even as the walls rose, the stakes climbed higher. This was not just construction, it was a gamble on Russia's future, and failure meant more than just rubble. Amid the relentless labor, the heartbeat of a new city took shape. At the island's core, the main redoubt towered, a grim sentinel. Along the walls, casemates, warehouses, and armories clustered like veins carrying life into this iron heart. Yet tools were scarce, materials tight, and hands even fewer. Speed was their only weapon against time and shortages. In parallel, Peter understood that walls alone could not claim the sea. He ordered the creation of a shipyard. By the summer of 1704, at the mouth of the Okhta River, the Admiralty shipyard was born. The location was chosen with surgical precision. Calm waters, proximity to forests, and a safe harbor for vessels yet to come. From that shipyard flowed the lifeblood of Russia's nascent navy. Small vessels for the Neva flotilla, galleys, gavatis, and doubleslips. Timber floated down from northern provinces, hemp from the Volga region, while ropes twisted on site, forged by hands pushed beyond human limits. But to fuel this relentless machine, Peter issued a grim decree in 1705. Peasants from distant provinces were to be sent in waves to the growing city. Hundreds marched for a week or more, only to face hellish conditions upon arrival. Forced to work from dawn till dusk, waist-deep in icy waters, living in makeshift huts, mud pits, or out in the open, survival was a cruel lottery. The death toll climbed mercilessly. Over 5,000 souls perished in a single autumn, swallowed by cold, hunger, and disease. They were buried at the very ramparts they had built, in mass graves, unmarked, forgotten. This was the grim origin of the City of Bones. Tales soon spread, whispers turning into legends. Stories that the soil of the Neva's Delta was soaked in the blood and agony of the nameless dead. People said every stone held a silent scream, that the city was cursed by the spirits of the fallen. Yet Peter, brutal and unyielding, dismissed these fears as superstition, his eyes fixed on a vision far beyond mortal pain. For Peter, this was no mere city. It was the future of Russia, a strategic masterpiece defying nature itself. By 1707, the first blocks of Vasilyevsky Island began to take shape. Peter dreamed of a city planned with the precision of a general's map. Straight streets, broad avenues, canals instead of roads, streets aligned perfectly with the cardinal points. Most of this vision would remain trapped on paper, but the principle was clear. Unlike the chaotic sprawl of Moscow, Saint Petersburg would be a city of order and reason, a rational, rectangular puzzle. Into this vision entered Domenico Trazzini, a Swiss architect from Ticino, trained in Italy. Arriving amidst the chaos, he became the chief architect of Peter's dream. Trazzini's buildings reflected Northern European austerity, simple, symmetrical, with tiled roofs and stripped of unnecessary decoration. Under his hand, barracks, official residences, hospitals, and churches rose, giving form to the raw city. He also shaped the first embankments and laid out streets, imprinting the islands with a new order. His work would come to define the Petrine Baroque style, a legacy etched in stone and timber. Among the earliest structures stood a humble wooden church of Peter and Paul, destined to be replaced by a stone cathedral, the city's architectural crown and symbol. Meanwhile, Peter built himself a modest summer palace on the waterfront, 2 floors, large windows, a flat roof, where he spent the summer of 1706. Here he balanced receptions of foreign ambassadors with hands-on oversight of the relentless construction. Behind this calm facade was a man steering a nation's destiny on a knife's edge. The city grew rapidly. By 1710, more than 20,000 souls called it home. Along the Neva's shores, warehouses, docks, and workshops multiplied like a living organism. In the center stood the formidable Peter and Paul Fortress, the heart of this precarious dream. Yet every brick was soaked in sacrifice, every street shadowed by death. The cost was immeasurable, the consequences irreversible. Peter's vision had become a monument to determination, but also to the terrible price of ambition. Will the city built on bones and sacrifice become the gateway to the future, or a tomb for those lost beneath its foundations? Will Peter's ruthless drive forge a Russian empire, or unleash a curse that haunts generations? The answer lies in every stone, every log, every whispered legend of Saint Petersburg, the city born of iron will and human suffering. If you want to unravel more stories where history's fate hinges on impossible choices, subscribe to Quiet History. What does it take to build a city from nothing? Who pays the ultimate price when ambition meets the unforgiving forces of nature? And how do decisions made in the name of progress bury countless lives beneath the foundations of a new empire? These questions haunt the birth of Saint Petersburg, a city forged in pain and iron will that would forever alter Russia's destiny. Saint Petersburg did not rise from marble or grandeur. It was born from mud, blood, and relentless toil. The fortress, imposing and heavily armed, stood as a symbol of imperial might, but hidden beneath the surface was a darker truth. Tens of thousands perished during the first brutal winter, unknown and unremembered. These nameless souls laid the raw groundwork of the city, their sacrifice the very foundation upon which the capital would rise, yet their stories remain lost in shadow. Why is St. Petersburg called the city of both will and pain? Because it was sculpted not from ease or luxury, but from the suffering of exhausted hands piling earth into walls, enduring damp, cold, and death. This was a place where life was cheap, and every shovel of soil carried the weight of countless lives extinguished before their time. Yet from this grim crucible emerged a city destined to redefine Russia itself. Peter the Great saw beyond the swamp and the wooden shacks. He envisioned a lasting capital, one that would not crumble to fire, rot, or time. To achieve this, he shattered centuries of tradition. In 1714, he issued a sweeping decree. Stone and brick construction was banned everywhere in Russia, except St. Petersburg. This was no mere regulation. It was a ruthless redistribution of the empire's resources, funneling all the finest materials to his new city at the expense of the old. This decree turned St. Petersburg into the empire's absolute priority. All brick and cut stone destined for ancient cities like Moscow, Pskov, and Smolensk now flowed exclusively into the city on the Neva River. The consequences were severe. Any attempt to smuggle building materials out was met with brutal punishments, from confiscation to corporal penalties. The whole nation's infrastructure was sacrificed to forge a single, ironclad capital. But materials alone would not build this city. Peter's vision demanded skilled hands, builders, masons, carpenters, tile makers, plasterers, summoned from every corner of Russia. They came not as volunteers, but by imperial order, herded from their homes and sent down winding rivers toward the Neva's delta. Their lives were harsh, cramped in barracks without heat, sleeping on straw, working from dawn until darkness swallowed the sky. Death stalked these workers relentlessly, yet the city's skeleton slowly took shape. Alongside Russian craftsmen arrived a wave of European architects and engineers, many personally invited by Peter or recommended through foreign embassies. Among them, Domenico Trezzini stood out, a man who would become the first official architect of St. Petersburg, entrusted with shaping not just buildings, but the soul of a city. Trezzini introduced order and symmetry where chaos once reigned, imposing a bold vision of straight streets, uniform blocks, and grand squares that echoed the ambitions of a modern empire. Trezzini did not merely design structures. He revolutionized construction through standardized architectural modules, model facades that would speed up building, simplify supply lines, and make oversight possible across the sprawling cityscape. His influence turned the chaotic swamp into a planned metropolis where every residential house, barrack, and government building adhered to this new, unified blueprint, embodying the spirit of a city born to endure. By the early 20s, the city's skyline began to rise with Trezzini's signature touch. The Summer Palace, a masterpiece of Northern Baroque with lofty cellars, mansard roofs, and grand windows. The Kunstkamera, the empire's first scientific museum. And the 12 Collegia, a monumental building housing the empire's central administration. But beneath these triumphs lay the harsh reality. Each stone laid was soaked in the sweat and blood of those who labored and died, forging a capital from the bones of a forgotten multitude. Every decision, every decree, every brick redirected from old Russia to this swamp-turned city was a gamble with irreversible consequences. What was gained in power and prestige was paid for in human suffering and sacrifice beyond measure. St. Petersburg was not just a city. It was a testament to the cost of empire, ambition, and the ruthless march of history. The question remains, could the glory of a new capital justify the price of so many lost lives? Or was St. Petersburg doomed from its inception to be a city built on bones, forever balancing on the edge between triumph and tragedy? If you want to uncover more stories where history is shaped by choices and their devastating consequences, subscribe to Quiet History. What if your world was turned upside down by a single decision? What if centuries-old traditions were shattered overnight? How does a society cope when the very rules that defined power and privilege no longer apply? This was the challenge facing the Moscow boyars as Peter the Great forced a monumental shift, relocating the capital to a harsh, unfamiliar city on the Baltic shores. St. Petersburg was more than just a new city. It was a crucible of transformation. Its freezing climate and remote location terrified many, but the true fear was the destruction of the old order. In this new capital, noble lineage, ties to the patriarchate, and court connections meant nothing. Advancement demanded speed, skill, and ruthless efficiency. Peter openly valued personal merit, knowledge of foreign languages, loyalty, and competence over birthright. To force the reluctant elite's hand, Peter issued strict decrees. Starting with the year 1714, officials from the 8th rank upward were ordered to move to St. Petersburg immediately, with their families. Defiance wasn't tolerated. Punishments ranged from reprimands to fines, and even dismissal. Some wives were expelled simply because their husbands failed to obey. No excuses, no illnesses, no housing problems were accepted. The message was clear: resist, and face the consequences. In private letters, the poet and diplomat Fyodor Polikarpov captured the grim reality. Boyars stare into him as if into a cold grave, some to their homes, others to exile, and it's impossible to tell which is which. The old Moscow aristocracy found themselves trapped between loyalty and fear, caught in a web of irreversible choices. Yet it was not only the nobility who resisted. The church, too, stood as a bastion of opposition. After Patriarch Adrian's death in 1700, Peter left the patriarchal throne in Moscow empty. Instead of appointing a new patriarch, he created the Holy Synod in 1721, a collective body fully under state control. This radical restructuring stripped the church of its political power, transforming it into a mere instrument of state ideology. Saint Petersburg bore no grand cathedral or religious infrastructure for years. Monasteries, central to Moscow's spiritual life, were nearly absent. Early churches were small and wooden, shadows of Moscow's grandeur. Only in 1721 did construction begin on the stone Peter and Paul Cathedral, a stark symbol of the new spiritual order, one subordinated to the crown. While some clergy embraced these reforms, becoming their champions, most saw St. Petersburg as alien territory, dominated by engineers, naval officers, foreigners, and bureaucrats. The city was a strange and unsettling environment for a church steeped in tradition, deepening the divide between old and new Russia. Despite resistance, by the mid-10s of the 18th century, St. Petersburg had become the seat of the Senate, the heart of administrative reform, and the monarch's residence. Orders were signed, regulations crafted, fleets assembled, and foreign dignitaries received, all without a formal declaration. Quietly but decisively, St. Petersburg replaced Moscow as the political core of the empire. Moscow remained the cultural and spiritual center, but the pulse of power had shifted to the banks of the Neva. St. Petersburg was not only a capital, it was a symbol of a new era, a new will, a break from the past. This rupture was painful and fraught with uncertainty, yet it laid the foundation for the Petrine epoch. By the early 10s of the 18th century, St. Petersburg shed its image as a mere outpost amid swamps. It boasted streets, embankments, government buildings, docks, shipyards, warehouses, and markets. But beneath this veneer of progress lurked relentless hardship. The city's daily life was a brutal struggle against water, disease, hunger, cold, damp, and an ever-present fear of the unknown. Built on unstable ground, the Neva's floods haunted the city's earliest decades, turning progress into catastrophe. The most devastating flood struck on November 7, 1721. Water levels rose more than 3 meters, swallowing streets and homes, threatening the fragile dream of a new Russia forged in ice and water. These were the stakes of Peter's vision. A nation reborn through sacrifice and relentless will. But at what cost? The choices made in those harsh years echoed through history, each decision a line in the story of a country torn between past and future. Subscribe to Quiet History to uncover more stories where fate, fear, and power collide in the making of empires. What happens when nature refuses to bow to human ambition? When a city built on fragile foundations faces a relentless flood of water rising to 2.5 meters. Streets disappeared beneath the waves. wooden houses torn from their stilts and swept away by the current. Warehouses crumbled, stores rotted, and the people were forced to climb onto roofs, into churches, even military barracks to survive the deluge. Yet not all made it. Some perished in the chaos. This catastrophe left a scar on the memory of the city, a grim reminder that on the banks of the Neva, nature's fury would long outmatch any architectural plan or gleaming facade. But the worst was yet to come. Floodwaters didn't just destroy property. They spread filth and disease with terrifying efficiency. Waste mingled with water sources, latrines, wells, polluting markets and storerooms alike. Summer in this city turned into a breeding ground for sickness. Dysentery, intestinal infections, scurvy, colds. These were constant threats. In the surrounding lowlands, malaria thrived, carried by relentless swarms of mosquitoes whose bites brought fever, rashes, and maddening delirium. Doctors were few and far between, pharmacies were scarce and only attached to infirmaries. Medicine was a luxury most could not afford. Desperation drove many to rely on herbal remedies, compresses, and prayers. But when death loomed, hope was fragile. The first hospitals, lazarettos, emerged in the early 18-teens, mainly to serve soldiers and officials. One stood near the Admiralty, a symbol of care reserved for the privileged. For common workers, access to medical help was almost impossible. Illness ravaged families, especially in the brutal winters when food and fuel ran scarce. Mortality among builders and their kin soared to deadly heights. The city's poor lived in hastily constructed housing, thin walls, drafty rooms, leaky roofs, and smoking stoves that barely kept the cold at bay. Soldiers and laborers huddled in barracks, dugouts, or cramped huts where frost crept in and ink froze in the dead of winter. Water turned to ice, and mornings brought frost clinging to every scrap of clothing. Fuel arrived by water, but even slight delays meant freezing homes and spreading sickness. The city was growing rapidly, attracting a mix of souls, some sent by imperial decree, others drawn by the promise of fortune or a fresh start. Craftsmen, traders, small entrepreneurs, foreign specialists, they flooded the streets with hope and desperation. Many sought work, shops to open, or land to claim. Yet the city demanded endurance. Those who couldn't withstand its hardships left. Those who stayed planted roots deep into this unforgiving soil. Trade was born at the water's edge. At the docks near the Admiralty, by St. Isaac's Meadow, and along the Moika River, merchants sold bread, dried fish, cabbage, honey, kvass, and tobacco. Money was scarce, and barter ruled daily life. A sack of onions could be exchanged for boots. Firewood could be traded for woolen cloth. Supplies arrived from the south and along the Volga, but winter brought isolation when ice sealed the waterways. The city faced frequent food crises, the worst in the winter of 1715, when the frozen isolation drove starving residents to burn wooden bridges just to ration out bread. City officials struggled to impose order amid the chaos. In 1714, the Maine Police Office was created to oversee street cleanliness, fire safety, trade regulations, and price controls. Rules were introduced to curb drunkenness and disorder. Yet enforcement was weak. Police forces were too few, many corrupted by bribes, and night patrols feared venturing into the dark alleys. Crime flourished. By night, one risked muggings in shadowy lanes, drunken brawls at the docks, and robberies on the outskirts. To instill fear and maintain some semblance of control, authorities staged public punishments. Executions were held in the Fortress Square or Trinity Square, drawing crowds hungry for spectacle and warning. Amid this turmoil, the city's spiritual life struggled to find footing. Churches were few, and most were built not by the people, but by official decree or elite initiative. Faith was a fragile anchor in a city constantly battered by nature's wrath, disease, hunger, and violence. Each decision, the building of a hospital, the enforcing of a curfew, the burning of a bridge, carried irreversible consequences. The people of this burgeoning metropolis lived on the edge of survival, caught between the relentless forces of nature and the heavy hand of authority. Their lives were shaped by choices, some forced, others desperate, but all sealing their fates in the harsh landscape of early 18th century Petersburg. Would the city rise stronger from the floodwaters and sickness? Or would these early trials doom its people to endless suffering? Only time would tell, but the shadows of these fateful years lingered long in the collective memory, a testament to the cost of survival and the price of progress. For more untold stories of history's pivotal moments, subscribe to Quiet History. What does it mean when a city is not just a place, but a living extension of a man's will? How far can one individual impose order on chaos, and at what cost? Peter the Great's vision for Saint Petersburg was nothing less than a dramatic rebellion against nature itself, an engineered masterpiece designed to embody a new Russia. Every street aligned to the compass, each window sized with purpose, no trace of randomness allowed. This was no ordinary city. It was Peter's own flesh and stone, sculpted from sheer force of will and tireless labor. But what happens when the man behind the myth finally falls silent? On the 28th of January, 1725, Peter the Great died. The news froze the city, a place so entwined with his identity that many could not believe the sovereign's end was real. 8 March saw his burial in the Peter and Paul Cathedral, a humble tomb at the heart of a temple where he had decreed his eternal rest. The city seemed to hold its breath, caught between grief and disbelief, as if the stones themselves mourned their creator's disappearance. Yet the legend was only beginning to unfold, a myth where architecture became biography, and streets stretched like the fingers of his hand, reaching beyond death. St. Petersburg did not die with Peter. Instead, it transformed into a living testament to his vision, a rational, modernized Russia turned toward Europe. Built on frozen ground, battered by winds and ice, it stood as proof that a ruler's will could bend nature and history itself. The city was no longer merely the capital. It was a symbol, a relentless argument for progress and reform. Each stone laid whispered of power's irreversible imprint on the world, a bold challenge to fate and tradition. Successors to Peter embraced this legacy with their own ambitions. Catherine I took up the mantle, continuing the cathedral's construction, transforming it into a dynastic mausoleum. Anna Ivanovna introduced the Winter Palace, the first of its kind in stone, cementing permanence. Elizabeth Petrovna summoned Bartolomeo Rastrelli to reshape the city in Elizabethan Baroque, gilding facades and interiors with royal splendor. Even Paul I, obsessed with knightly orders and German discipline, could not escape the city's magnetic grip, though he dreamed of shifting power elsewhere. Each ruler's choice deepened the city's role as a stage for authority and spectacle. St. Petersburg grew into more than an administrative hub. It became a grand theater of power, where foreign envoys were received, decrees signed, and parades commanded the streets. Shipyards birthed new fleets, forts rose defiantly by the waters. The Senate, the Academy of Sciences, the Admiralty, each institution anchored the city's identity as the heart of a new empire. Order and control shaped its very layout, European precision meeting the ambition of a nation reborn. Yet beneath the surface, every building whispered the tension of human fear, of losing control, of the consequences yet unseen. St. Petersburg was not just a city. It was memory itself, a sacred space of dynastic continuity. The Peter and Paul Cathedral, austere and free from Byzantine excess, with its golden spire piercing the sky, became the eternal resting place of almost all Romanov rulers. Even those who ruled from Moscow, like Nicholas II in his final years, could not ignore the cathedral's sacred pull. The choice of resting place was no accident. It was a declaration that power and history were inseparable here, wreathed in the shadow of the founder's vision. Among these symbols, none loomed larger than the bronze horseman, Catherine the Great's imposing statue of Peter astride a rearing horse, cloaked in antique majesty. The monument pointed forward toward the Neva River, the sea, and the promise of Europe. It was more than bronze and stone. It embodied willpower itself, shaping the very flow of history and geography. In this figure, the myth of Peter the Great was immortalized, a sovereign who remade a nation by sheer force of determination, carving his legacy into the heart of a city destined to outlive him. Russian literature, born amid the shadows and splendor of St. Petersburg, mirrored this duality of pride and unease. For Pushkin, the city was a creature risen from the marshes, a symbol of human ambition struggling against natural limits, a place where fate and choice collided violently. The streets were not merely paths, but battlegrounds of history, where irreversible decisions echoed through time, shaping the soul of a nation still wrestling with its own reflection. St. Petersburg stands today as the ultimate monument to a man whose decisions shaped an empire. It asks us, what happens when power tries to rewrite the world itself? When architecture becomes destiny, and a city becomes the living embodiment of one man's irreversible choices? The answers ripple through history, carried on the winds that sweep across its frozen canals, quiet reminders that every bold act invites consequence, and every legacy is forged in the crucible of fear and ambition. If this story of power, fear, and transformation has captured you, don't forget to subscribe to Quiet History for more journeys into the moments that changed everything. What happens when one man's will shapes an entire city? When a single decision sparks a relentless clash between power and the individual? In The Bronze Horseman, the statue is not just a monument, it is a living contradiction, symbolizing both the triumph of civilization and the crushing threat to the common man. Evgeny, the poem's tragic hero, descends into madness, caught in the cold grip of an indifferent city. And then comes the chilling final scene, the statue chasing the man, a haunting metaphor for the eternal struggle between authority and human spirit. But this was only the beginning of St. Petersburg's dark tale. Nikolai Gogol, saw St. Petersburg not as a city, but as a maze of oddities, phantoms, and bureaucratic obsession. His stories, like Nevsky Prospect, The Overcoat, and Diary of a Madman, turned the city into a stage for personal loss and psychological torment. The city's streets become a reflection of inner chaos, a place where identity dissolves into shadow. What madness lurked beneath the city's surface? What cost did its order demand? The answers were as unsettling as the fog that swallowed its alleys by night. Fyodor Dostoevsky saw the city as a battleground for the soul. St. Petersburg's labyrinthine streets charted the tortured path of Raskolnikov, from crime to redemption, from hubris to forgiveness. Here, every corner echoed with spiritual conflict, every stone weighed with moral gravity. But beyond the pages of literature, this city lived as a force itself, growing, expanding, suffocating under its own ambition. Marble palaces and granite monuments rose like frozen hymns to order, symmetry, and control. Yet even the grandeur of empire style could not mask the deeper, darker pulse of the city beneath. St. Petersburg was no mere city. It was a symbol forged by the relentless hand of Peter the Great. The mighty fleet that guarded it, the shipyards of the Admiralty, the naval academies shaping Russia's seamen, all were vital pillars of this geopolitical window to Europe. Through the Baltic, Russia reached out to the world, and the city stood as the gateway that never closed. This was more than technology or architecture. It was the embodiment of a vision, a grand design stretching across centuries. But that vision came at a price. Thousands of lives were sacrificed to build this empire of stone and water. The people whispered of St. Petersburg as the city on bones, a haunting reminder that beneath its dazzling surface lay a graveyard of human suffering. This brutal contradiction between the unyielding will of power and the bloodied cost of progress was etched into the city's very DNA. Here, every step forward carried the echoes of those who had paid with their lives. The shadows that clung to the grand facades told stories of sacrifice no official record could erase. And even today, when the sun casts its cold light on the spire of the Peter and Paul Cathedral, the shadows fall just as sharply. The outstretched hand of Peter the Great does more than point to the Neva River. It calls relentlessly toward the future. From a swamp, a city was born, not just marked on a map, but etched deep into the soul of a nation. It stands at a crossroads of will, authority, suffering, and hope, forever a testament to the irreversible choices that shaped Russia's destiny. St. Petersburg's story is a chain of fateful decisions, each one driving the city forward even as it tore countless lives apart. It is a living paradox, a monument to power and to human sacrifice, a battleground between the individual and the state. This city, born from ambition and soaked in blood, remains an enduring symbol of Russia's complex soul. The struggle between control and freedom, between order and chaos, continues to echo through its streets to this very day. If you want to uncover more secrets hidden in the shadows of history, subscribe to Quiet History. The past is never silent.